Okay.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. Today is New Year's Eve in 1970, and tonight we're going to do a recap of the decade.
First we'll go to Charlotte for a recap of the presidents.
Go.
Hi, I'm Starlet, and I'm going to be talking about the presidents of the 1960s. So our first president was John F. Kennedy, and as the Cold War continued in the 1960s, Kennedy took office facing the spread of communism, a war, and the threat of a nuclear war. Kennedy believed that democracy combined with prosperity would contain or limit the spread of communism. Kennedy worked toward a diplomatic settlement. He indicated that he would remove the U.S. missiles in Turkey and Italy if the Soviets removed their missiles in Cuba. Our next president after the tragic assassination of John F. Kennedy was LBJ. On November 1st, 1963, JFK was assassinated and Vice President LBJ was president. President Johnson asked Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent any further aggression. And here is Catherine with the Civil Rights Movement.
Hi, it's Catherine. I'm here to talk about the Civil Rights Movement and MLK. Over the past decade, civil rights has made major progress concerning the ease of voting and separation of education. Starting with the Greensboro sit-in in 1960, people of all ages began peacefully protesting racial inequality. Some protests would be organized through civil rights organizations like the NAACP or SCLL, or performed through everyday acts like the Montgomery bus boycott. Through these protests, activists like Martin Luther King accomplished many goals for the movement, including the Federal Transportation Commission, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act. However, these advancements happened slowly and often at a high cost for protesters, as many went to jail or were attacked. As such, more radical militant civil rights groups emerged, appealing to young African Americans by promising change quickly. Militant leaders like Malcolm X often were at odds with Martin Luther King Jr., as their similar goals and unlike methods often tended to cause tensions within the movement. These leaders, however, managed to influence American society greatly, even beginning to make an impact on de facto segregation. People of all races participated in the civil rights movement. Both Robert and John Kennedy frequently spoke out about the unfairness of many business practices. The immense progress achieved in this decade made way for a new era for all races, not just one. By 1969, new amendments had been made, people had been educated, and citizens began to heal. However, there is still much to do in regards to civil rights. Thanks for listening. Here's Lauren talking about the tragic assassinations of the decade.
Hey, it's Lauren. I'm here to talk about the tragic assassinations of the 1960s. So our first assassination was John F. Kennedy, our president, and he traveled to Dallas, Texas to mend political fences for his 1964 re-election bid. Lee Harvey Oswald perched on a window by the site on the 6th floor, and he fired 3 shots at the president, the third hitting the back of his head and killing him. John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Right after the assassination, LBJ was inaugurated. Then Martin Luther King Jr. was a major advocate for the civil rights movement. He supported nonviolent protests. King addressed the death threats towards him, saying, "Like anyone, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will." The next day, he was on his balcony of his hotel room and was shot from a high-powered rifle. He died in the hospital on April 4th, 1968. Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, was campaigning to run for president, and he stopped his campaign speech to inform the audience of MLK's assassination. Kennedy asked people to honor King's memory by replacing their anger and desire for revenge with an effort to understand with compassion and love. Despite this, riots broke out after MLK's assassination. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was also assassinated. Now off to Ashley for a recap of women's triumphs and failures of the previous decade.
Hi, I'm Ashley. Today I'm going to be talking about the triumphs and failures of women over the past decade. Okay. First, we're going to talk about important women. First, Betty Friedan, who is the leader of the National Organization for Women. Also, Gloria Steinman, who used mass media and Miss Magazine to promote women's rights. Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman Supreme Court Justice, and all of their goals were to end the discrimination. One major triumph for women was getting Title VII passed. Title VII was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it got an outlawed sex discrimination. Another major triumph was the Equal Opportunity Act. It made it illegal to deny credit to women just for their gender. Unfortunately, women were not successful in everything, and they failed to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. Women like Phyllis Schlafly opposed this amendment. Let's hope the next decade brings a lot for women. Okay, now let's go to Charlotte to talk about 1960s fashion.
Okay, one back here was fashion, and some of the popular fashion were the Jackie Kennedy outfits, known as sensible low-heel shoes, although many women still preferred high heels. In the early years, a fashion idol was Jackie Kennedy, with her perfectly white pearls and her tailored suit dresses. The jumper dress captured the youthful, playful side of 1960s fashion. Big bows, large round collars, pastel and polka dots were all dress details. Checkerboard stripes and polka dots, color block were all placed on short shift dresses. There was also a trend of earth tone colors, moss green, earthly browns, mustard yellow, and burnt orange. Here's Catherine talking about the escalation in Vietnam.
Hi, I'm back to talk about the escalation of involvement in Vietnam. In 1964, a non-aggressive American ship was fired at by North Vietnamese forces. While relatively unaffected, the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, demanded action to be made. Johnson believed in a vision for a better America in the 1960s, and within that vision, America should become victorious in the Cold War. After Kennedy slowly began involvement in Vietnam's Civil War in the 1950s, Johnson officially sent in troops to help South Vietnam through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Initial support for the war began to decline once they realized the war would be more costly than expected, taking money, supplies, and young lives away from America. The anti-war movement grew stronger, especially on university campuses when the draft continued, fueling President Johnson's increasing demand for soldiers. Additionally, support for the government fell as journalists began publishing stories that didn't align with what LBJ was reporting. This credibility gap increased tensions between radical pacifists, otherwise known as doves, and war supporters, otherwise known as hawks. Some progress did come out of this struggle, however. The 26th Amendment, granting 18 to 20-year-olds the right to vote, was passed, conceding the popular opinions of the capability of young people involved in the war. It took much longer for the government to concede to ending the war. After the Tet Offensive and numerous unsuccessful peace talks, President Nixon began Vietnamization in 1969, or the transition from an American-led militia to a South Vietnam-led militia. The success of this progressive action is yet to be seen, but America is very glad to see an upcoming end to the never-ending war. Now off to Lauren to talk about entertainment and music.
Hi, I'm back and I'm here to talk about entertainment and music of the 60s. There is a generation gap causing a lack of understanding and communication between the baby booms and their younger children. Rock and roll music set the baby boomers apart from their parents. This music became a defining characteristic of the baby boomers. More than 70 million Americans watched the Beatles perform on Ed Sullivan's television show. The Rolling Stones were still popular in the 1960s. There was a violent outbreak at a Rolling Stones concert where an African American was stabbed to death. Many popular movies came out in the 60s, such as To Kill a Mockingbird, West Side Story, Spartacus, The Sound of Music, Oliver, and many more. Bewitched, Gilligan's Island, The Addams Family, and Brady Bunch, and The Flintstones were some of the popular TV shows. Marvin Gaye, The Beatles, The Beach Boys, The Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Led Zeppelin, and the Jackson 5 were some popular music artists of the decade. Now back to Ashley at the studio to talk about the counterculture movement.
Hi, I'm back in the studio to talk about the counterculture movement. It was influenced by the beat movement of the 1950s. These people experimented with recreational drugs, new clothing styles, and music. The This caused a generation gap between the older and younger generation because of differing values. The older generation valued loyalty and authority, while the younger generation valued themselves and individuality. They often lived in communes, which are small communities where they share resources and have common interests. Some of the positives from the counterculture movement was that it opened the minds of many Americans. But unfortunately, many people died from drug overdoses, and violence did continue.
I hope y'all enjoyed this recap of the 1960s.
Happy New Year!